I want to talk broadly about drafting bills and amendments. It's obviously an important role for the legislative lawyer, particularly in state government, but also at the federal level in drafting bills and amendments. And there's definitely an art to drafting bills and drafting them well, which comes easily to some and is probably more difficult or challenging for others. I think the critical factor in all of this is whether the bill's language is developed so that it's clear enough to accomplish the intent and objectives of the bill's author, and whether the bill language can be readily understood by third parties that were probably not privy to the legislative discussions involving the development of the bill language. There are a number of California legislative rules that require all bills and amendments to be in what we call legislative council form prior to the bill or amendment being processed by either the Assembly desk or the Senate desk. As a result, regardless of whether another party does the initial drafting of a bill or an amendment, the attorneys with the Office of Legislative Counsel ultimately will do the formal drafting and may even tweak some of the language that had been previously written by somebody else in order to ensure that the new proposed statutory language is consistent with other code sections. And the Legislative Council attorneys, of course, determine where to place a new law in the code books. There are numerous California government code sections that are relevant to bill and amendment drafting, including provisions related to the duties of the Office of Legislative Counsel, as well as those related to the enactment of statutes and the operation of statutes as well. The Office of Legislative Counsel is certainly aware of the types of measures, bills, resolutions, constitutional amendments, and of course, drafting issues like double jointing amendments, effective versus operative dates, et cetera. And of course, are well aware of the general rules of statutory interpretation or statutory construction as they draft these measures. Now, on occasion, a client legislator may direct the legislative council deputy to not make any changes to the bill language because it was subject to careful crafting or negotiation, and they don't want to disrupt the agreement that was reached among interested parties. As a result, sometimes legislators and staff work closely with the deputy on the desired language throughout the legislative process. On some drafting requests, the legislator knows exactly the bill or amendment language that they want, or the legislator's sponsor does. In other instances, the drafting request made to the legislative council deputy may be very broad. Please draft me a bill to do X. And thereafter, the deputy drafts the bill from scratch. But in either of these instances, with a general request or a specific request for bill drafting, the attorneys in the Office of Legislative Counsel utilize their drafting rules, guidelines, statutory construction principles, and others to draft those bills and amendments. Really the initial question in drafting a new bill where you're proposing a new statute, or even when you amend or repeal an existing one, you look at where will the new language be placed amongst the 29 codes, or which section are you going to be amending or repealing? There are just over 155,000 individual sections in the California codes. Now, although Legislative Council drafts the bill language, on average, there's 8 to 10,000 bill requests and more than 10 to 12,000 bill amendment requests. These very skilled lawyers at the OLC have to craft all of these bills as well as the numerous amendments to different bills. And they have a keen insight in interpreting statutes and certainly utilize form language, but also they do a lot of drafting from scratch. Now, the following are some examples of the bills and amendments that are drafted by the Office of Legislative Counsel. including amending a section of code, adding a section of code, repealing a section of code, adding a chapter of code, adding an article to a code, adding multiple sections to code, drafting uncodified statutes, intent language, urgency clauses, amending initiative statutes, drafting special or general legislation, drafting bills that make an appropriation or bills that impose a local mandate, drafting 3 different types of resolutions, constitutional amendments, and then, of course, amendments to those 5 different types of legislative measures. Obviously, there are many options in drafting bills and amendments, and those persons working on legislation, legislators, staff, interest groups are greatly assisted by the attorneys at the Office of Legislative Counsel.